Hello, my name is Hagitte Gal-Ed. I am an Israeli-born artist, researcher, psychotherapist, and educator, and a published author in the field of psychology of peace. My research interest is on the process of consciousness as it's connected to our creative experiences, particularly in existentially meaningful experiences. So when we are traumatized, we are using creative visual making to heal, to express, to expand our capacity to reorient ourselves and to recreate our consciousness. The same thing happens in peace education. There is a good reason why, both in psychotherapy and in peace education, we are leaning towards the medium of art, particularly visual expression, as a means to process and elaborate any kind of possibility for relationability, for change ability. In other words, the dialogic concept, the Buberian dialogic concept of I and thou. This is a key to human mental health, to a possibility to have any kind of peace ever. Unfortunately, as our technology taking over education and the media, and particularly social media, games, and the pictorial image processing, we become subject to the engineering, technological engineering of those processes that previously used to be more organically a part of our life experiences. When technology is directly communicating to our limbic system, it avoids our processing via consciousness, orientation, and logical thinking. We stop becoming critical thinkers. We become slaves to technology, to technological engineering. And that is a scary prognosis to humanity as we know it right now. Let's look at my first slide. Consciousness is an inevitable emancipatory effect of existentially meaningful creative experiences. This used to be the truth throughout human evolution. If you look at picture number 1, let's move to the picture number 1. You see how the connection, the touch of the hand on the walls of a prehistoric cave, be it in France 30, 40, 50 years ago, or in Patagonia 2,500 years ago, or in Israel just a few years ago, or in the United States now. We have a need to orient ourselves by a tactile connection, by in relation, because we are an in relation beings. So we also know by in relation being. Let's move to the next slide. Consciousness is a mental state of perpetual becoming. So that as we go through experiences in life, we create, we formulate orientation by the actual experience in our surroundings, in our relationships with objects, with people, with everything around us and inside us. It's a dual relationship. It is not just one directional. So that when modern technology is projecting images and messages directly to our limbic system, It avoids this dual connection because it cuts off our capacity to intervene and participate with a conscious choice. And that is a great danger. You can see it all around as the young generation develops so much depression and suffers from so much anxiety, and people lose self-concept, self-confidence, because there is lack self-orientation. Next. In the next slide, you will see a very interesting thing. Regardless of time, even today, as here illustrated by a drawing of a child 4 years old, thinking about something that happened in time he doesn't even know, but he can know in a different way. When he relates to the possibility of that, it looks to us like prehistoric. Look how similar his compositional drawing is to the prehistoric marks on the wall. Okay? So in relation, the relationability is critical. And when modern technology takes it away from us, what do? Are we going to change our developmental processes all over? Who is going to control it? Is it going to be reality as we used to know it? Or is it going to be a fake reality controlled by technocrats? Let's move on. Next slide. Here in this slide, you see evidence to my argument. These two works were done in the United States by high school students just a few years ago. And what do they show when they are given the opportunity to express what concerns them the most at this moment in time, at the present time? And if you look at what this boy put on the sticks, sticking into a symbolic head, looking very much like a prehistoric sculpture or skull, you see family, you see money, you see friendship, you see school, you see life. And if you look at this work by the girl in the same school at the same time, the same thing. These are horrors that our young generation is going through. And the more we leave them alone with no means, with no tools to process stress, to process that which is ineffable to them, that which is traumatic to them, what are we doing? What kind of education do we do when we do not help them process their personal development? And we just teach them math and sciences and this and reading and blah, 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 informational stuff with no regard to their personality development and developmental needs. Let's move to the next slide. Art and peace are similar in many ways. Art is a realm of experience in which we organize, we orient ourselves. And in the end of a process of a creative experience, something new comes, an insight. That is what we call a consciousness emergence. It emancipated through the actual creative experience. When we take it out of our educational system, what are we doing? When we present art as a scientific subject of study, turning it into some intellectual blah blah, what are we doing? We ignore totally the connection between the emotional intelligence and the intellectual cognitive one. If we become slave to the scientific, intellectual, cognitive pioneering concept of education and knowledge, we are losing the capacity to keep our spirit, souls, and psyches integrated. That's what we cause. And when you look at soldiers coming with PTSD or other people with what we call complex chronic post-traumatic syndrome, look what happens to them. A total disconnect between the emotional and the intellectual, between the feeling and the capacity to process it so that it comes out as a new insight, as a consciousness. In this regard, the current revolution within the scientific community, basically led by Rupert Sheldrake and other people like him, and a philosopher, Richard Goff, they talk about morphogenetic powers, energies, processes, working within the universe of life, and you can see them manifested in biology, in plants, in animals, in human behavior, in morphology of water crystals and snow and ice and so on and so forth. I looked into, in psychology, in studies in psychology, to who are the researchers who were looking in a similar way, who were trying to see that we as human beings are part of a live universe, a universe of life, the universe that made it possible for us to be alive. It's impossible to imagine that, well, science does, but it's impossible for me to imagine that our psyche, our spirit, our being is so diverse, divorced, different, far away, cut off from the powers that guide life all around us. And so, when I did my research that took over 10 years, and which finally came up with the concept of articulation, the goal was to see whether or not in our consciousness processes there is a way in which we can make this connection. If we can articulate, keep the articulation moving between the intellectual and the emotional, between the known and the unknown. And sure enough, after 10 years of a grounded theory methodology, it came out that this in relation capacity that Buber was talking about is the core capacity that makes it possible. It is not a dialogue in the terms of ping pong, say this, say that, says it. It's not the verbal dialogue that defines it. It's the relational capacity to be in relation. And when you are in relation, and it's a genuine sense of a dialogic relationship, pay attention to this. Both sides change mutually. Let's move to the next slide, and from now on, we'll move on. Here is a boy in this high school who has a trauma. He did not want to be recruited to the army, but has a family with a long history of military background. And he discovered what the media, controlled by the government, disclosed, kept away from our knowledge about wars. In this particular case, it's the Gulf War. So he made the research, and he used exactly the same kind of technology, video and slides and online research and whatnot. And within a few months, he created an archive of images that were prohibited from public knowledge. And he wrote a poem, and he created an environment installation, and he presented it as a collaborative project with a classmate of his, as you can see here. These are the fears. And this is how he processed his fears. And in the end of which, he come out with a stronger sense of self, with a new self-orientation, with a new sense of self-esteem. And he is overcoming his PTSD by the creative process in the arts. Let's move on. Next. Now, articulation originally was conceptualized in order to explore the consciousness effect of image work. The concept of image work was also presented by Martin Buber in his dialogic ontology. He talks about this capacity as the one that differentiates us from other animals. The ability to imagine, the ability to symbolize, the ability to think abstract, the ability to create concepts. It started with visual images, and it continues throughout our developmental life. Look at a modern human baby. Before he can say mama kaka pipi, he already does all kinds of doodles around on the walls of your kitchen and everywhere else. There is something built in us that is so fundamentally, inherently human. And if we take this capacity out of our education, out of our psychotherapy, out of our public social consciousness, and we allow some technology to take over it and immediately communicate with our limbic system beyond our ability to create orientation, I would call it technological slavery and a crime against humanity. That is in my language. And articulation was set up so that we can do ongoing research, a case study by case study by case study. Let's move on. Here is what you will see now in the next, This is actual pictures from my PhD research in the context of psychology of peace, when we had 3 groups, American high school and freshman college students, Israeli and Palestinians, get together for art projects. In this particular picture that you see here, the topic was just Noah's Ark, and the question was, how did these animals and humans manage to survive for 40 days and 40 nights along this journey of survival? What did they know that allowed them to survive and come out in peace? That we don't know, that we don't use nowadays. These are some of the images that you can see. People were standing next to each other, elbow to elbow, walking over the large paper on the floor, asking for colors from each other, cooperating, moving this. And it did not stop them from expressing fears, dislikes, even hatred, even horrible expressions against each other, but at the same time, keep working together towards the goal of, I am being genuinely authentic, articulating with you right now. And the more genuine the dialogue was, the more genuine we saw later on a reflection, a conscious reflection, and willingness to accept the fact that in this process, both of us have changed somehow and came closer to each other. Let's move on. So, consciousness is also a process of configuration, and it is an organic function within the actuality of the image work experience. We just saw it. This happens by the actual choice and change activities that the participant oneself is doing. And choice and change is done not only in solitude. Yes, you do it like an artist in your studio, but you are outside in society. You are affected by relationships. So choice and change are also relational, vibrational dynamics. It is not just an intellectual choice. Move right, move left, move black, move white. There are consequences to each choice. You see it in art immediately. And when you see it immediately, you can relate to it immediately. And you can now discuss and elaborate and process what is the real meaning of change. It always happens in mutuality, whether you like it or not. Let's move on. Here is a boy who lost his mother before he was 2 years old. He is using the process to get closer through a grief process. So here is the bleeding heart. That's he made it from clay and painted it red, and he is taking it home. He made wings to give him the feel that he can be an angel, fly to meet his mother, whom he lost. That is the creative process that he can go through in order to overcome the grief process. Let's move on. Here is a girl who at age 12 already tried 3 times to commit suicide because she had been so badly abused by her family. She survived. And now as she's processing it through telling stories, through dramatizing, through acting out, playing, costumes making, masks making, drawing and whatnot, she is processing what her psyche needs to process in order to regain self-orientation, new consciousness, self-esteem. Now she's a fantastic, successful young woman. Let's move on. So, without relationability, there is no consciousness. And we knew it from early on. We were lucky that somehow our human brain figured out that the visual work, that image work, is an effective tool to process this capacity, and in the end of it, to get an insight about ourselves and about the universe, the world in which we live. And so, when you have the time, you can always stop the presentation and read more about it. Let's move on. Here is a woman who has been so badly traumatized. First of all, was born with a distorted brain and was terribly traumatized all her life, especially when later in life she was very intelligent. She became independent. She was self-sufficient. She was working in a highly reputable company. But her husband was so abusive that he almost killed her. And when she ran out of the house screaming, "Help me, help me, help me," and she was naked because he almost killed her in bed, he called the police to take her to a psychiatric where another whole line of horrible experiences happened. Now, in articulation, she found a safe place where she can now process the demons that were haunting her all her life. Look what she's doing here, and this is not a young girl. This is a woman in her 50s, and she is processing these demons, and she's saying, wow, now I can get them out of myself. Okay, that's the creative process, and it's still, yes, let's move on. Let's move on. On the right side, you see a blind man He created a sculpture, a statue of Jesus and two followers. How come a blind man can do that? What senses does he use? What kind of articulation between what sides of his brain or whatever they call it? He is able to connect in order to do that. And that's what articulation is geared for and to, specifically and purposefully, to this capacity that we have inside us, regardless of what happens to us in our life. This capacity is in us. And that is the core of our learning, education, changing, improving, and psychotherapy capacities. And he did it, a blind man. The next one is another one that is reconstructing his life, the life that he lost in his experience. And he is using, really building an environment around himself, so he can surround himself by these memories that he recreated artistically, visual images in which he planted himself. And that was the process for him to overcome his own trauma. Let's move on. Two people, same place, same time. This is current. This is now in the United States, while I'm working with adult people in psychotherapy with the modality, my modality of articulation. People who never had a self-concept that had anything positive about them. The woman on the side, on the right side, was kicked out of school because she had dyslexia, and the school decided that they cannot teach her anymore. She taught herself how to read and write. And regardless of whatever learning disabilities that she had, she became a full functioning woman, married, mother, and grandmother. I gave her the possibility to look at herself life size. What if this is your life? This is yourself. And this is a life-size self-portrait. Look at it. She is her own angel. The man on the other side, never ever in his life, never ever touched a brush, a paint, or anything that had anything to do with art. Never. Not in school. He doesn't even remember what he did in kindergarten. He doesn't remember if he went to kindergarten. He happened to have a criminal past. Look at him now. This is what he confronts by himself while looking at himself in self-portrait, life size. He is processing it. And he's processing much deeper than just talk, conceptual cognitive talk. This goes much deeper because it integrates the conscious and the less conscious, the emotional and the cognitive together. So let's move on. Finally, articulation is a concrete realm to process the profound experience of creative courage and mutual change, because it takes courage. Just as it took courage to go out in prehistoric time and hunt for food, so it took courage to look into the ineffable, the unknown, and show it on the walls. And by putting it out, be able to process what it is that I cannot do, what it is that I do not know, and regain, regenerate, recreate a new orientation and a new self-esteem. Now, at the same time, articulation is structured in such a way that you can do the research both individually and on groups and collect this information so that you can see how the actual articulation between all the parts of the brain, the psyche and the physical, the tactile and the emotional come together. That's what makes us humans. Let's move on. Here is a girl processing her anorexia. I don't need to say much, just look at it. when she presented herself, looking at herself in the mirror. It took a month to work on this project. Do you imagine the kind of process that she had to go inside with the support, in this case me, but it can be anybody who is open up to this concept of relationability, of mutual changeability, of the power and the capacity that is hidden in every one of us to integrate articulation between all the phases, all the possibilities that we have, and find the courage to become who we can really be. That's how she processed it. Let's move on. Another girl. We see sometimes symbols recurring. The human eye becomes a recurring symbol in many, many processes of traumatic experiences. In this case, by a high school student who made a collage and finally built it into a sculpture, an environmental thing, so that it's not a flat, it's three-dimensional. Let's move the next one and you'll see. Okay. There is no understanding of consciousness without understanding A, the vitality of the psyche and its articulatory potency. B, the fundamental role of image work in human development. And C, the existential meaning of relationability and mutual change in the actual articulation of the consciousness configuration. So this is my statement and hopefully a little contribution to the big debate about consciousness. Let's move to, show me the many eyes. This was done just 2-3 months ago in my practice right now. A woman who was damaged as a fetus just by electrical shock, and her constitution was changed dramatically. It's interesting to see how she is processing fears and anxieties and depression. And we see the same image popping up again. I am not going into any psychoanalytical and all kinds of other pseudo-intellectual, whatever, analysis of the image itself. We can do that. I'm not interested in it here. What I am interested in is to see the effect that the approach of articulation had on her ability to process her pain, to process her problems. She felt independent. She became encouraged. She became empowered and able to do that. And she is making major progress day by day by day. Let's move to the last. When we practicing articulation, whether in education or psychotherapy, what we do is we face the ineffable with the freedom of choice. We respond with profound relationability, personal creativity, and consciousness growth. We experience autonomy, authenticity, and being present. We sustain self-integrity. We improve choice-making and leadership skills. We engage in dialogue of mutual change. We learn peace by making peace. We participate in reality building, and then we are empowered. Thank you.